The hidden passage. Like the previous summers, Theo and his mother had rented a small cottage on a quiet, windswept island. On the first morning, as they were walking to the familiar beach, Theo slowed down. To their left, the cliffs dropped sharply, and below them lay a narrow cove he had never noticed before, rough, empty, and edged with jagged rocks. His mother, already a few steps ahead, turned when she sensed he wasn't beside her. "Everything okay, love?" she asked, brushing hair from her face. Theo nodded quickly. "Yeah, just looking." She smiled, but he saw the flicker of concern she tried to hide. The same look she'd had when he was small and insisted he could go in the water all by himself. At the beach he played in the warm shallows, but his eyes kept drifting towards the cliffs. Above them gulls circled like pale specks. He wondered what the hidden cove felt like, untouched and silent. The next morning his mother asked, "Would you like to try a different place today? You don't have to stay with me all the time." Theo hesitated. Then, surprising himself, he said, "I want to have a look at those rocks." She followed his gaze. The drop looked steep, the rocks unfriendly. "Well, if you go, be careful, and when you've had enough, come back here. I'll be at the big beach." For a moment, Theo almost told her to come along with him, but he swallowed the impulse and nodded. His mother watched him go, fighting the desire to call him back and walk with him. "He mustn't feel he ought to stay with me," she reminded herself, though her stomach tightened. The path down to the cove was rough and almost vertical in parts. When Theo reached the bottom, he saw a stretch of dark green water slipping between rocks. A group of older local boys, lean and suntanned, were taking turns leaping from a boulder into a deep pocket of water. He approached them slowly. One of the boys gave a quick nod, the simple, casual invitation that meant he wasn't unwelcome. Theo's heart beat fast as he climbed the rock and jumped. The water hit him like a cold glove, and when he surfaced, the boys were already climbing up for their next turns. Then one of them dived towards the far cliff and disappeared behind a narrow seam of stone. Another followed. Theo stared. There must be some kind of hidden passage in the rocks. He tried diving towards it, but the water stung his eyes and he couldn't make out anything except shifting green. When he came up coughing, the boys were already swimming away to another part of the shore. Theo watched them go, feeling both relieved and frustrated. He spent the rest of the morning trying to find the gap, but the cove kept its secret. Eventually, he returned to the big beach, where his mother sat reading under a faded blue umbrella. "You were gone a while," she said lightly, but her eyes searched his face closely when he shrugged. "Just exploring." That night he dreamed of the hidden seam in the cliff, a dark slit just wide enough for a determined swimmer. As soon as breakfast was over, he headed back to the cove, swimming goggles dangling from his wrist. With his goggles on, the underwater world sharpened. Swirls of sand, silver flashes of fish, the rippled floor of the cove. He dived again and again, scanning the cliff wall. Finally, behind a curtain of seaweed, he discovered a narrow crack leading into darkness. He backed away fast, heart pounding. His mother's voice rose in his mind. "Be careful, Theo, please." But another voice, more insistent, said he could do it. He only needed to learn to hold his breath longer. So he practiced. Each dive pushed him deeper, farther, longer. By the time he returned to the cottage each evening, he was exhausted and dizzy. His mother fussed over his sunburn and the salt in his hair, but she didn't stop him. "He's nearly 13, she told herself one evening as she prepared dinner. "I have to let him try things." But her hand shook slightly as she sliced tomatoes. On their last full day, Theo woke early with a feeling that today was the day. He slipped out before his mother was awake, leaving a note. "Gone to the cove, back later." At the water's edge, the tide was calm and the entrance to the crack looked smaller than ever. He took a long breath, adjusted his goggles, and dived. Cold water wrapped around him. He reached the crack and pulled himself inside, twisting his shoulders sideways. The rock brushed his back and scraped his arms. For a moment he panicked. It was darker than he'd imagined, and the ceiling felt too low. But he kept moving, pushing with his feet, pulling with his fingers. The passage widened suddenly, then narrowed again. His lungs began to ache. His heartbeat drummed loud in his ears. "Go," he told himself, "just a little more." A faint brightness appeared ahead. With the last of his strength, he kicked hard and burst out into open water on the far side of the cliff. Sunlight sparkled on unfamiliar stones. The sea here was calmer, clearer. He broke the surface gasping, dizzy with triumph, and clung to a rock to rest. For a long moment he simply floated, letting the sunlight warm his trembling body. When he finally swam the long way around the cliffs to the main beach, he saw his mother scanning the water, her forehead creased. "Theo," she called, relief in her voice. I found a passage," he said, still catching his breath. She came to the water's edge, resting a hand lightly on his shoulder, her eyes taking him in, the faint scratches on his arms, the intensity in his gaze. "Well," she said softly, "I suppose you're not little anymore." Theo grinned. "And I can stay underwater for 2 minutes, 3 minutes at least." She looked at him sharply for a moment. "Well, I shouldn't overdo it. I don't think you should swim any more today." She was ready for a battle of wills, but he gave in at once. It was no longer of the least importance to go to the cove. Today's episode was inspired by the short story Through the Tunnel by Doris Lessing. It was originally published in the American weekly magazine The New Yorker in 1955. And now, let's go through some useful vocabulary you can take away from the story. The cliffs dropped sharply. If something drops sharply, it falls very steeply or suddenly. This can describe physical movement, but also sudden changes in numbers or levels. Example: sales of new homes dropped sharply last month. A flicker of concern. A flicker of concern is a brief, subtle sign of worry that appears for a moment and then disappears. Example: there was a flicker of concern in her eyes when she heard the news. His eyes kept drifting towards the cliffs. If something keeps drifting towards something else, it moves there slowly and repeatedly, often without conscious effort. For example, during the meeting, his thoughts kept drifting towards the weekend. He swallowed the impulse. To swallow an impulse means to stop yourself from acting on a sudden feeling or urge. Example: she swallowed the impulse to interrupt and stayed quiet. He couldn't make out anything. To make something out means to see, hear, or understand something with difficulty. For example, I could hear them talking, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. She fussed over his sunburn. To fuss over someone means to show a lot of concern or attention, often in a slightly anxious or overprotective way. For example, he had a cold and his parents kept fussing over him. He slipped out. To slip out means to leave quietly or without being noticed. Example, she slipped out of the room before the meeting ended. Dizzy with triumph. If someone is dizzy with triumph, they feel overwhelmed or lightheaded because of a strong feeling of success or victory. Example, she crossed the finish line dizzy with triumph. A battle of wills. A battle of wills is a situation where two people are determined not to give in to each other. Example, homework often turns into a battle of wills in our house. He gave in at once. To give in means to stop resisting and accept something. This phrase is very common in everyday English. For example, he nagged me so much for a new bike that eventually I gave in. Before we wrap up, here are a few questions to invite you to think more deeply about the story. If you wish, you can share your answers in the comments below. Theo's mother gives him freedom but remains quietly anxious. How does the story show this balance between letting go and caring? At the end, Theo feels that the cove no longer pulls at him. Why do you think this is? And what has changed inside him? Theo's experience feels like a small but important step into adulthood. Can you remember a childhood adventure that made you feel a little braver or more grown up? I'll share my own thoughts in the comments. I hope you've enjoyed this story. In episode 3, we'll step into the world of Agatha Christie and spend some time with my favorite fictional detective as he takes on a curious and unsettling case. And as always, we'll explore some interesting words along the way. Until then, happy listening!